supplies the rhomboideae, latissimus dorsi and trapezius, and anastomosis with the transverse scapular and subscapular arteries, and with the posterior branches of some of the intercostal arteries. Peculiarities. The ascending branch of the transverse cervical frequently arises directly from the thyrocervical trunk, and the descending branch from the third, more rarely from the second, part of the subclavian. The internal mammary artery, arteria mammaria interna, arises from the under surface of the first portion of the subclavian, opposite the thyrocervical trunk. It descends behind the cartilages of the upper 6 ribs at a distance of about 1.25 cm from the margin of the sternum, and at the level of the 6th intercostal space divides into the musculophrenic and superior epigastric arteries. Relations. It is directed at first downward, forward, and medialward behind the sternal end of the clavicle, the subclavian and internal jugular veins, and the first costal cartilage, and passes forward close to the lateral side of the innominate vein. As it enters the thorax, the phrenic nerve crosses from its lateral to its medial side. Below the first costal cartilage it descends almost vertically to its point of bifurcation. It is covered in front by the cartilages of the upper 6 ribs and the intervening intercostales interni and anterior intercostal membranes, and is crossed by the terminal portions of the upper 6 intercostal nerves. It rests on the pleura as far as the third costal cartilage, below this level upon the transversus thoracis. It is accompanied by a pair of veins. These unite above to form a single vessel, which runs medial to the artery and ends in the corresponding innominate vein. Branches. The branches of the internal mammary are pericardiacophrenic, anterior mediastinal, pericardial, sternal, intercostal, perforating, musculophrenic, superior epigastric. The pericardiacophrenic artery, arteria pericardiacophrenica, arteria comes nervi phrenici, is a long slender branch, which accompanies the phrenic nerve, between the pleura and pericardium, to the diaphragm, to which it is distributed. It anastomoses with the musculophrenic and inferior phrenic arteries. The anterior mediastinal arteries, aa mediastinalis anteriores, mediastinal arteries, are small vessels, distributed to the areolar tissue and lymph glands in the anterior mediastinal cavity and to the remains of the thymus. The pericardial branches supply the upper part of the anterior surface of the pericardium. The lower part receives branches from the musculophrenic artery. The sternal branches, rami sternalis, are distributed to the transversus thoracis and to the posterior surface of the sternum. The anterior mediastinal, pericardial, and sternal branches, together with some twigs from the pericardiacophrenic, anastomose with branches from the intercostal and bronchial arteries, and form a subpleural mediastinal plexus. The intercostal branches, rami intercostalis, anterior intercostal arteries, supply the upper 5 or 6 intercostal spaces. 2 in number in each space, these small vessels pass lateralward, one lying near the lower margin of the rib above, and the other near the upper margin of the rib below, and anastomose with the intercostal arteries from the aorta. They are at first situated between the pleura and the intercostales interni, and then between the intercostales interni and externi. They supply the intercostales, and by branches which perforate the intercostales externi, the pectorales and the mamma. The perforating branches, rami perforantes, correspond to the 5 or 6 intercostal spaces. They pass forward through the intercostal spaces and, curving lateralward, supply the pectoralis major and the integument. Those which correspond to the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th spaces give branches to the mamma, and during lactation are of large size. The musculophrenic artery, arteria musculophrenica, is directed obliquely downward and lateralward, behind the cartilages of the false ribs. It perforates the diaphragm at the 8th or 9th costal cartilage, and ends, considerably reduced in size, opposite the last intercostal space. It gives off intercostal branches to the 7th, 8th, and 9th intercostal spaces. These diminish in size as the spaces decrease in length, and are distributed in a manner precisely similar to the intercostals from the internal mammary. The musculophrenic also gives branches to the lower part of the pericardium, and others which run backward to the diaphragm, and downward to the abdominal muscles. The superior epigastric artery, arteria epigastrica superior, continues in the original direction of the internal mammary. It descends through the interval between the costal and sternal attachments of the diaphragm, and enters the sheath of the rectus abdominis, at first lying behind the muscle, and then perforating and supplying it, and anastomosing with the inferior epigastric artery from the external iliac. Branches perforate the anterior wall of the sheath of the rectus, and supply the muscles of the abdomen and the integument, and a small branch passes in front of the xiphoid process and anastomoses with the artery of the opposite side. It also gives some twigs to the diaphragm, while from the artery of the right side small branches extend into the falciform ligament of the liver, and anastomose with the hepatic artery. The costicocervical trunk, truncus costicocervicalis, superior intercostal artery, arises from the upper and back part of the subclavian artery, behind the scalenus anterior on the right side, and medial to that muscle on the left side. Passing backward, it gives off the profunda cervicalis, and, continuing as the highest intercostal artery, descends behind the pleura in front of the necks of the first and second ribs, and anastomoses with the first aortic intercostal. As it crosses the neck of the first rib, it lies medial to the anterior division of the first thoracic nerve, and lateral to the first thoracic ganglion of the sympathetic trunk. In the first intercostal space, it gives off a branch which is distributed in a manner similar to the distribution of the aortic intercostals. The branch for the second intercostal space usually joins with one from the highest aortic intercostal artery. This branch is not constant, but is more commonly found on the right side. When absent, its place is supplied by an intercostal branch from the aorta. Each intercostal gives off a posterior branch which goes to the posterior vertebral muscles, and sends a small spinal branch through the corresponding intervertebral foramen to the medulla spinalis and its membranes. The profunda cervicalis, arteria cervicalis profunda, deep cervical branch, arises in most cases from the costocervical trunk, and is analogous to the posterior branch of an aortic intercostal artery. Occasionally it is a separate branch from the subclavian artery. Passing backward, above the 8th cervical nerve and between the transverse process of the 7th cervical vertebra and the neck of the first rib, it runs up the back of the neck, between the semispinalis capitis and colli, as high as the axis vertebra, supplying these and adjacent muscles, and anastomosing with the deep division of the descending branch of the occipital and with branches of the vertebral. It gives off a spinal twig which enters the canal through the intervertebral foramen between the 7th cervical and 1st thoracic vertebra. End of section 18.